The afternoon sun beat down on Westlake Elementary as children poured out of the building, backpacks bouncing as they raced toward waiting parents. Teachers stood watch at the crosswalk, their bright orange vests glowing as they guided excited kids across the street. Nobody noticed the sleek white BMW convertible until it was almost too late. Jessica Harrington pressed her designer heel against the gas pedal, her music blasting as she sped down Maple Avenue. She was already running late for her spa appointment, and these school zones were such a pain. The speed limit sign flashed 15 miles per hour, but Jessica's speedometer hovered around 35. She glanced at her phone as a new message popped up, taking her eyes off the road just as a small boy stepped into the crosswalk. Mrs. Reynolds, a veteran crossing guard, thrust her stop sign forward and shouted. The boy froze like a deer in headlights as Jessica slammed on her brakes, the BMW's tires screeching against the pavement. The car stopped mere feet from the terrified child. "Oh my God, watch where you're going!" Jessica yelled out her window as if the child had done something wrong. Parents gasped. Mrs. Reynolds helped the shaking boy to safety while shooting a furious look at Jessica, who merely flipped her sunglasses back on and checked her lipstick in the rearview mirror. She didn't notice the police cruiser parked just beyond the school zone until blue lights flashed behind her. "Perfect. Just perfect," she muttered, pulling over and grabbing her phone to text her spa that she'd be late. Officer Diaz approached the vehicle, his face serious but professional. "License and registration, please." Jessica barely looked up from her phone. "Do you know how important my appointment is? I'm already running late." "Ma'am, you were doing 35 in a 15 miles per hour school zone. You nearly hit a child." Jessica sighed dramatically and dug through her purse, pulling out her license along with her father's business card. She held the card up first. "Look, my dad's Richard Harrington. Harrington Properties. He's golfing with the mayor this weekend." She smiled as if this settled everything. Officer Diaz didn't take the card. "I'll need your license and registration, please." Jessica's smile vanished. She slapped her license into his hand and reached for the glove compartment. "This is ridiculous. Don't you have actual criminals to catch?" As Officer Diaz reviewed her information, Jessica pulled out her phone and started recording. "Just so everyone knows," she said to her social media followers, "I'm being harassed for literally nothing." She flipped the camera to show Officer Diaz, who remained focused on writing the ticket. "Ma'am, please put the phone down while I'm conducting official business." "It's a free country," Jessica shut back, continuing to record. "My followers should see how cops waste taxpayer money bothering innocent people instead of doing real police work." Officer Diaz returned with the citation. "You were speeding in a school zone and nearly caused an accident. I'm issuing you a ticket for reckless driving." Jessica didn't take the ticket. Instead, she zoomed her camera in on Officer Diaz's badge. "What's your badge number? My father's attorney will be in touch." "Ma'am, refusing to accept the citation doesn't make it go away. Please take the ticket and sign here." Jessica finally grabbed the paper, crumpling it slightly. "Whatever. My dad will handle this." As she signed, she added, "You should think about who you're dealing with before you ruin your career." That's when Officer Diaz noticed the strong smell of alcohol. "Ma'am, have you been drinking today?" Jessica's face flushed. "That's none of your business. I had one mimosa at lunch." "One. I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." "Absolutely not," Jessica said, starting her engine. "I'm already late." Officer Diaz placed his hand on the car door. "Step out of the vehicle now." Jessica turned her camera back on. "Everyone watch this. I'm being discriminated against." She refused to move, gripping her steering wheel tightly. What began as a routine traffic stop quickly escalated as Jessica continued to refuse lawful commands, her entitlement spiraling into obstruction. When backup arrived and she still wouldn't comply, Jessica found herself being helped from her BMW, handcuffed, and placed in the back of a police cruiser, her spa appointment definitely cancelled. As the police car pulled away, parents and teachers watched in stunned silence. Mrs. Reynolds put a protective arm around the boy, who had nearly been hit, both of them watching as Jessica's perfectly planned afternoon transformed into something she never expected: accountability. 2 weeks later, Jessica strutted through the courthouse doors wearing a cream-colored designer suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her high heels clicked against the marble floor as she checked her reflection in her phone camera, adjusting her perfectly styled hair. The night in jail after her arrest had been a nightmare, but her father's fancy lawyer had gotten her out by morning. Now she just had to get through this silly court appearance. "This whole thing is a waste of time," she complained to her attorney, Douglas Williams, a gray-haired man in an expensive suit who had been on her father's payroll for years. "Can't we just write a check and be done with it?" Attorney Williams gave her a stern look. "Jessica, please take this seriously. Judge Carter doesn't mess around. He's one of the most respected judges in the county." Jessica rolled her eyes and went back to scrolling through social media. Her latest posts about being persecuted had gotten tons of sympathy from her followers. Some even called her brave. The bailiff's voice boomed through the courtroom. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Solomon Carter." Everyone stood except Jessica, who was busy typing a text. Her attorney nudged her sharply, and she looked up with annoyance. Judge Carter, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and a dignified presence, was already entering the courtroom. Jessica reluctantly got to her feet, sighing loudly enough for the first 3 rows to hear. Judge Carter took his place at the bench, his dark robes a stark contrast to the polished wood surroundings. His eyes, keen and observant, swept across the courtroom before he nodded to the bailiff. "Please be seated," the bailiff announced. As people settled into their seats, Jessica pulled out her compact mirror and checked her makeup. A woman behind her cleared her throat disapprovingly, which Jessica ignored. "Case number 475,223, State versus Jessica Harrington, charges of reckless endangerment, resisting arrest, and obstruction of justice," the court clerk announced. Judge Carter looked at Jessica over his reading glasses. "Miss Harrington, are you present with counsel?" Her attorney stood. "Yes, Your Honor." Douglas Williams representing Ms. Harrington. Jessica remained seated, tapping away at her phone. Judge Carter's eyes narrowed slightly. "Ms. Harrington, in my courtroom, defendants stand when addressed by the court." Jessica looked up, surprised by the direct address. Her attorney gave her another nudge, and she stood with obvious reluctance. "Whatever," she muttered, just loud enough to be heard. A subtle tension filled the room. Judge Carter's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes, not anger, but a quiet assessment. "How does the defendant plead?" Judge Carter asked. "Not guilty on all counts, Your Honor," Attorney Williams replied quickly. "And we'd like to motion for immediate dismissal of all charges. My client is a respected member of the community with no prior criminal record." Jessica nodded and smiled confidently, as if her attorney had just won the case. When she noticed Judge Carter watching her, she tried to arrange her face into something resembling humility, but it came across as more of a smirk. "The prosecution opposes this motion, Your Honor," said District Attorney Lena Chen, rising from her seat. "We have clear evidence, including officer body camera footage, showing Ms. Harrington endangering children in a school zone and subsequently refusing lawful orders." Jessica whispered loudly to her attorney, "She's exaggerating. It wasn't that big a deal." Judge Carter's gaze sharpened. "Ms. Harrington, are you addressing the court?" "No, I was just." "When you wish to speak in my courtroom, you will do so only when recognized, and you will address the court properly. Is that understood?" Jessica blinked, clearly not used to being interrupted. "Yes, sir." "You will address me as Your Honor," Judge Carter corrected her, his voice firm but not unkind. "Yes, Your Honor," Jessica repeated, her tone verging on mockery. Judge Carter studied the paperwork before him. "Motion to dismiss is denied. The evidence warrants a proper trial." He looked up at Jessica, who was already back on her phone. "Ms. Harrington, devices are not permitted to be used during court proceedings." Jessica reluctantly put her phone away, rolling her eyes when she thought the judge wasn't looking. "Trial is set for 2 weeks from today," Judge Carter continued. "And Ms. Harrington, I suggest you use that time to reflect on the seriousness of these proceedings. This court does not recognize privilege, wealth, or status, only the facts and the law." As Judge Carter moved on to the next case, Jessica slumped in her chair and whispered to her attorney, "This is ridiculous. My father is going to be furious." Little did she know, her behavior had not gone unnoticed, and Judge Carter's reputation for patience was about to be tested like never before. The day of the trial arrived with dark clouds hanging over the courthouse, matching the mood inside courtroom 304. Jessica walked in 15 minutes late, carrying a takeout coffee cup despite the clear "no food or drink" signs posted on every door. She wore a tight-fitting dress that looked more appropriate for a nightclub than a courtroom, paired with sunglasses she didn't bother to remove until her attorney whispered something in her ear. "Sorry I'm late," she announced to no one in particular as she sauntered to her seat. Traffic was crazy. In reality, she'd spent an extra half hour at the cell and getting her nails done, convinced her appearance at court was just a formality. Judge Carter was already seated, his expression unreadable as he watched Jessica disrupt the proceedings. The courtroom fell silent as all eyes turned to her, but Jessica seemed to enjoy the attention, smiling and flipping her hair as she settled into her chair. "Now that Ms. Harrington has decided to join us," Judge Carter said, his deep voice commanding respect, "we can proceed with opening statements." District Attorney Chen approached the jury box first. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about responsibility and safety. The evidence will show that on April 15th, the defendant drove recklessly through a school zone, endangering young lives. When confronted by law enforcement, she refused to comply with lawful orders, believing herself above the rules that keep our community safe." Jessica doodled on a notepad, occasionally looking up to study her manicure or check the time on her diamond-encrusted watch. Her attorney kept nudging her to pay attention, but she just nodded and drifted back into her own world minutes later. "The prosecution calls Mrs. Eleanor Reynolds to the stand," D.A. Chen announced after finishing her opening statement. The crossing guard from the school zone walked to the witness stand, her hands slightly shaking as she was sworn in. Unlike Jessica, she wore simple clothes, a floral blouse and navy slacks that had seen better days. "Mrs. Reynolds, please tell the court what you witnessed on April 15th, D.A. Chen requested. "I was helping children cross at Westlake Elementary, like I do every school day for the past 12 years, Mrs. Reynolds began, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "That white BMW came speeding through, going at least twice the limit. I had to grab little Tommy Baker and practically yank him back to the curb." Another second, and her voice cracked. "Well, I don't want to think about what could have happened." Jessica's head snapped up. "That's not true," she blurted out, loud enough for everyone to hear. Judge Carter's gavel came down firmly. "Miss Harrington, you will have your opportunity to speak through your counsel. Another outburst like that, and you'll be held in contempt." Jessica crossed her arms and slumped back in her chair with a huff. As Mrs. Reynolds continued her testimony, describing how the BMW had screeched to a halt just feet from where children were crossing, Jessica pulled out her compact mirror and began fixing her lipstick. Several jurors exchanged glances, clearly noticing her behavior. Next, Officer Diaz took the stand. As he described Jessica's conduct during the traffic stop, she audibly snickered and whispered something to her attorney, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. After I informed her she was being cited for reckless driving, she refused to accept the citation and began recording me on her phone, Officer Diaz testified. She repeatedly mentioned her father's connections and implied there would be consequences for me professionally. D.A. Chen looked toward the jury. "And what happened when you detected alcohol and asked her to exit the vehicle?" "She refused multiple lawful commands and attempted to start her vehicle to leave the scene," Officer Diaz replied. "At that point, backup was called, and Ms. Harrington was placed under arrest for obstruction." "Your witness," D.A. Chen said to the defense attorney. Attorney Williams stood, clearly trying to repair some of the damage done by his client's behavior. "Officer Diaz, isn't it possible that my client was simply confused by your instructions? Perhaps scared by the situation?" Before Officer Diaz could answer, Jessica laughed loudly. "I wasn't scared. I just didn't think I should have to get out of my car for going a tiny bit over the speed limit." Judge Carter's patience visibly thinned. "Ms. Harrington, I have already warned you about speaking out. One more interruption and you will spend the night in custody." Jessica's mouth fell open in shock. She looked around as if expecting someone to defend her, but the courtroom remained silent. Even her attorney looked away, embarrassed. The prosecution would like to present Exhibit A, the body camera footage, DA Chen announced. As the lights dimmed and the video began to play on the courtroom screen, Jessica's demeanor on the recording was unmistakable, entitled, dismissive, and increasingly belligerent as Officer Diaz calmly tried to do his job. Several jurors frowned as they watched her on screen, pointing her finger at the officer and saying, "Do you know who my father is? He practically owns half this town." Jessica slid down in her seat as her recorded voice filled the courtroom, the reality of how others perceived her behavior finally beginning to sink in. For the first time since her arrest, a flicker of doubt crossed her face. This wasn't going according to plan at all. The courtroom fell silent as the video evidence concluded. Jessica's face had turned an uncomfortable shade of pink as she watched herself on screen, her behavior even worse than she remembered. The jury members exchanged glances, some shaking their heads slightly. Judge Carter cleared his throat. "We'll take a 15-minute recess," he announced, rising from the bench. "Court will resume promptly at 11:30. As soon as Judge Carter left the courtroom, Jessica grabbed her attorney's arm. "This is going terribly," she hissed. "Can't you do something? Object more or whatever it is you're supposed to do." Attorney Williams looked exhausted already. "Jessica, I've tried to explain the seriousness of this situation. The evidence against you is substantial." "My father isn't paying you to give up," Jessica snapped, loud enough for nearby people to hear. "He's paying you to win." A few rows back, Mrs. Reynolds sat quietly next to the boy who had nearly been hit that day. His parents had brought him to observe how justice worked. Now, he watched Jessica with wide, curious eyes, trying to understand why a grown-up would act this way. When court resumed, DA Chen called her final witness, Dr. Patel, head of the school's PTA and father of 2 Westlake Elementary students. "Dr. Patel, you were volunteering at the school that day. What did you observe?" DA Chen asked. "I was helping with the science fair setup when I heard tires screeching," Dr. Patel recalled. "I ran outside just as Officer Diaz was pulling Ms. Harrington over. Several children were crying, including my daughter. They were scared by how close that car came to the crosswalk." Jessica couldn't contain herself anymore. She stood up suddenly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is all being blown way out of proportion," she exclaimed, her voice echoing through the stunned courtroom. "I barely went over the speed limit, and that officer was totally targeting me because of my car." Judge Carter's gavel came down with a sharp crack. "Ms. Harrington, sit down immediately." But Jessica was on a roll now, months of entitlement and frustration pouring out. "I shouldn't even be here. My father donates to the Police Foundation every year. There are actual criminals you should be dealing with instead of harassing regular citizens over nothing." The courtroom went completely silent. Judge Carter's expression was calm, but his eyes held a storm. The jury watched, wide-eyed, as Jessica continued her rant. "And honestly, this whole trial feels biased. I mean, I made one little mistake, and you're treating me like some kind of hardened criminal." "Ms. Harrington," Judge Carter's voice cut through her tirade like steel. "You are in contempt of court. Bailiff, please escort Ms. Harrington to holding until she can compose herself." The bailiff, a tall woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, approached Jessica, who finally seemed to realize what was happening. "Wait, what? You can't do that." Jessica protested as the bailiff gently but firmly took her arm. "Do you know who I am? My father will hear about this." "I'm sure he will," Judge Carter replied evenly. "Court is in recess for 1 hour. When we return, I expect Ms. Harrington to have reflected on appropriate courtroom behavior." As Jessica was led away, her face a mixture of shock and indignation, her attorney quickly gathered his papers and hurried after them. The spectators in the courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations. In the holding cell, a small, stark room with a metal bench and not much else, Jessica paced back and forth. The reality of her situation was finally starting to sink in. Her phone had been confiscated, her designer heels echoed on the concrete floor, and for once in her life, her father's name and money weren't fixing the problem. "This is outrageous," she told her attorney when he arrived. "That judge clearly has it out for me." Attorney Williams sat on the bench, looking more tired than ever. "Jessica, listen to me very carefully. Judge Carter is one of the most respected judges in this district. He's known for his fairness, not his bias. What he won't tolerate is disrespect for the court. So what am I supposed to do? Just sit there while they all lie about me. You need to apologize, he said firmly. When we go back in there, you need to sincerely apologize to the court, to the witnesses, and to Judge Carter. And then you need to sit quietly and let me do my job. Jessica wanted to argue, but something in her attorney's expression stopped her. For the first time, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, she was on the wrong side of this situation. An hour later, as she was led back into the courtroom, Jessica noticed something she hadn't before. Behind the prosecutor sat several families with young children, the same children who had been at the crosswalk that day. Their parents had brought them to see justice in action, to see that actions had consequences, even for people like Jessica Harrington. As she took her seat, Judge Carter studied her carefully over his reading glasses. The entire courtroom waited to see what would happen next. Jessica sat stiffly in her chair as court resumed, the hour in the holding cell having left her shaken but not entirely humbled. She'd agreed to apologize, not because she felt she was wrong, but because her attorney had made it clear she had no other choice. "Your Honor," Jessica began, her voice softer than before. "I apologize for my outburst. It won't happen again." The words came out rehearsed, lacking genuine remorse. Judge Carter studied her for a moment, his expression giving nothing away. "Very well, Ms. Harrington. The court accepts your apology, but be advised that further disruptions will not be tolerated." He turned to Attorney Williams. "Defense, you may present your case." Williams stood, straightening his tie nervously. "The defense calls Ms. Jessica Harrington to the stand." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Jessica hadn't expected this. She shot a panicked look at her attorney, who nodded encouragingly. Taking a deep breath, she made her way to the witness stand, uncomfortably aware of all eyes following her. After being sworn in, Jessica settled into the chair, crossing her legs and trying to appear confident despite her racing heart. "Ms. Harrington," Williams began, "could you please tell the court, in your own words, what happened on April 15th? Jessica cleared her throat. "I was running late for an important appointment. I might have been going a little over the speed limit, but not dangerously so. That crossing guard is exaggerating. I was nowhere near hitting anyone." In the gallery, Mrs. Reynolds shook her head slightly. One of the jurors frowned. "And when Officer Diaz pulled you over, what was your state of mind?" Williams prompted. "I was frustrated, of course. I felt like I was being targeted because of my car and, well, because of who I am. People are always assuming things about me because of my family." Williams nodded sympathetically. "And did you intend to disrespect the officer?" Jessica hesitated, sensing a trap. "Not disrespect, exactly. I just thought he should know who he was dealing with so he wouldn't waste both our time." "No further questions, Your Honor," Williams said quickly, before Jessica could say more. D.A. Chen approached the stand, her expression calm but determined. "Ms. Harrington, the speed limit in that school zone is clearly posted as 15 miles per hour. Officer Diaz's radar showed you traveling at 35 miles per hour. Do you dispute that?" Jessica shifted uncomfortably. "Well, maybe I was going a little faster than I thought." "A little faster? More than double the legal limit in an area where children are present isn't a little faster, is it?" "Objection, argumentative," Williams called out. "Sustained," Judge Carter ruled. "Rephrase, Counselor." Chen nodded. "Ms. Harrington, are you aware that at 35 miles per hour, a vehicle needs approximately 135 feet to stop, compared to about 60 feet at 15 miles per hour?" "I'm not a math person," Jessica said with a shrug. Several people in the courtroom exchanged glances. Judge Carter's expression remained neutral, but his fingers tapped lightly on his desk. "Let's move on to your interaction with Officer Diaz," Chen continued. "You mentioned your father's name and position multiple times during the traffic stop. Why was that relevant to your speeding violation?" Jessica's composure began to crack. Because sometimes when people know who my dad is, they're more reasonable. More reasonable, or more willing to let you avoid consequences," Chen pressed. "Objection," Williams called again. "Overruled," Judge Carter said. "The witness will answer." Jessica's face flushed. "Look, I've never been in trouble before. My family has done a lot for this town. I just thought I didn't think it was fair to be treated like a criminal over something so small. Something small, Chen repeated. Ms. Harrington, we heard testimony that your actions nearly resulted in a child being struck by your vehicle. Do you consider that small? Jessica's eyes darted to the gallery, where she saw the boy from the crosswalk watching her intently. Something in his innocent gaze made her stomach twist uncomfortably. No, she admitted quietly. That wouldn't have been small. Chen nodded. In the body camera footage, you can be heard telling Officer Diaz, and I quote, "Don't you have real criminals to catch?" What did you mean by that? Jessica swallowed hard. I just meant. I didn't think I deserved to be pulled over. Because you're different from real criminals. What makes someone a real criminal in your opinion, Ms. Harrington? Jessica looked around the courtroom, suddenly aware of the diversity of faces watching her, people from all walks of life, all backgrounds. For the first time, she wondered how her words sounded to them. I don't know, she answered truthfully. Chen's next question hit like a thunderbolt. Ms. Harrington, do you believe the law applies differently to you than to others because of your father's position or your family's wealth? The question hung in the air. Jessica opened her mouth, then closed it again. The answer that would have come automatically to her just days ago, now stuck in her throat. No, she finally said, her voice barely audible. It shouldn't. No further questions, Chen said, returning to her seat. As Jessica stepped down from the witness stand, her legs felt unsteady. The confidence she'd walked into court with had evaporated, replaced by an uncomfortable awareness of how others perceived her. She glanced at Judge Carter, expecting to see judgment in his eyes, but found only a thoughtful, measuring gaze that somehow made her feel even smaller. Back at the defense table, she whispered to her attorney, "How bad was that?" Williams patted her hand. "Let's just focus on bringing in your character witnesses now." Jessica nodded absently, her mind still on Judge Carter's expression. For the first time in her life, she found herself genuinely wondering what someone else thought of her, and not liking the probable answer. The courtroom fell quiet as the defense called their final witness, a thin blonde woman named Tricia Palmer, one of Jessica's friends from her exclusive social circle. Tricia wore designer clothes similar to Jessica's and approached the witness stand with the same entitled air. "Ms. Palmer," Attorney Williams began after she was sworn in, "how long have you known Jessica Harrington?" "Since prep school," Tricia replied, her voice high and nasal. "We've been besties for like 12 years. And in your experience, what kind of person is Jessica?" Tricia smiled at Jessica. "She's literally the most generous person I know. Last year, she organized this charity thing at her country club that raised, I don't know, thousands of dollars for, some children's organization." Jessica nodded eagerly, grateful for this portrayal of her character. Judge Carter watched silently, his fingers steepled under his chin. "Would you describe Jessica as reckless or irresponsible?" Williams asked. "Oh, absolutely not," Tricia said emphatically. "Jessica is super responsible. I mean, she's always the designated driver when we go out. Well, most of the time." A faint murmur rippled through the courtroom at this qualification. D.A. Chen made a note on her legal pad. "No further questions," Williams said, looking pleased with the testimony. D.A. Chen approached the witness, her expression calm. "Ms. Palmer, you mentioned a charity event. Can you tell us which children's organization benefited from this fundraiser?" Tricia blinked rapidly. I think it was something about kids who need things. Jessica would know." "I see. And you stated Ms. Harrington is usually the designated driver when you go out. Has she ever driven after consuming alcohol?" Tricia's eyes darted to Jessica, who subtly shook her head. "Well, maybe once or twice, but only if she had like one drink, you know. Nothing major." "Nothing major," Chen repeated. "Ms. Palmer, are you aware that on the day of the incident, a breathalyzer test showed Ms. Harrington had a blood alcohol content of 0.06%? Objection. Williams stood up. "The BAC was under the legal limit of 0.08 and is not relevant to the charges before the court today." Judge Carter nodded. Sustained. "The jury will disregard the question." But the damage was done. Several jurors exchanged meaningful glances. Ken changed tactics. "Ms. Palmer, has Ms. Harrington ever received special treatment because of her family connections?" Trisha laughed nervously. I mean, who doesn't use connections if they have them? Last month we were at this restaurant that was totally booked, but they found us a table when Jessica mentioned her dad. And has she ever avoided consequences for breaking rules because of who her father is? Objection calls for speculation, Williams interrupted. I'll rephrase, Chen said smoothly. Ms. Palmer, have you personally witnessed Ms. Harrington avoid consequences by mentioning her father's name or position? Trisha hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Well, there was this one time we got pulled over coming home from a party. Jessica talked to the officer about her dad's golf game with the police chief, and we got let off with a warning. Jessica sank lower in her seat, her cheeks burning. She couldn't look at Judge Carter or the jury. After Trisha stepped down, Williams announced, "The defense rests, Your Honor." Judge Carter nodded. "We'll hear closing arguments after lunch. Court is in recess until 1:30. As people filed out of the courtroom, Jessica grabbed her attorney's arm. "This is going badly, isn't it?" Williams sighed. "Jessica, I've tried to prepare you for this possibility. The evidence against you is substantial. But my father said you never lose cases. Your father's influence can't change facts, Jessica. The best we can hope for is a lenient sentence." The word sentence hit Jessica like a bucket of cold water. Until this moment, she hadn't truly believed she might be found guilty. The reality of her situation finally began to sink in. During the lunch break, Jessica sat alone on a bench outside the courthouse, watching people walk by. Normal people with normal lives who didn't expect special treatment. For the first time, she wondered what that might be like. Her father had called twice demanding updates, but she let the calls go to voicemail. She wasn't ready to admit to him that his money and connections might not save her this time. Back in the courtroom, Jessica listened to the closing arguments with new attention. D.A. Chen painted a picture of a privileged young woman who believed rules didn't apply to her, who endangered children through reckless behavior, and who showed no genuine remorse. Williams countered by portraying Jessica as a basically good person who made a single mistake and was being unfairly targeted because of her family's prominence. As the jury filed out to deliberate, Jessica's stomach twisted with anxiety. Attorney Williams patted her hand reassuringly, but there was worry in his eyes. Judge Carter announced, "Court will resume when the jury reaches a verdict." Hours passed. Jessica paced the courthouse hallway, checking her watch every few minutes. Her father arrived, his face thunderous, demanding to know why his expensive lawyer wasn't delivering the expected result. "It's out of our hands now," Williams explained. "The jury will decide based on the evidence." "Evidence can be interpreted many ways," her father growled. "That's what I paid for." Jessica watched this exchange with new eyes. Had her father always been this way? Had she? When word came that the jury had reached a verdict, Jessica felt strangely calm. Whatever happened next, something had already changed inside her. As she walked back into the courtroom, she caught Judge Carter watching her, his expression thoughtful. For the first time since this ordeal began, Jessica met his gaze directly, without defiance or entitlement. She simply nodded, acknowledging him as the authority he was, not because of his position or power, but because of the quiet dignity with which he carried himself. The jury filed in, and Jessica held her breath, waiting to learn her fate. The courtroom was packed as everyone returned for the verdict. Jessica sat beside her attorney, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to stop them from shaking. Her father sat directly behind her, his face a mask of controlled anger. This wasn't how things were supposed to go for people like them. "All rise," the bailiff announced as Judge Carter entered the courtroom. Jessica stood on trembling legs. The judge's face revealed nothing as he took his seat and nodded to the jury. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" he asked. The jury forewoman, a middle-aged teacher with kind eyes but a firm expression, stood up. "We have, Your Honor." Jessica held her breath. The piece of paper in the forewoman's hand would determine her future. On the count of reckless endangerment, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of obstruction of justice, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of resisting arrest, we find the defendant guilty. The words hit Jessica like physical blows. Guilty, guilty, guilty. The courtroom spun around her, and she grabbed the table for support. Behind her, she heard her father muttering angrily to Williams about appeals and incompetence. "Order," Judge Carter said calmly, silencing the murmurs that had broken out. The jury is thanked and dismissed. We will proceed to sentencing. Jessica's heart hammered in her chest. This was it. This was really happening. Ms. Harrington, please rise, Judge Carter instructed. Jessica stood, struggling to maintain her composure. For once in her life, she had no clever comments, no entitled demands. She simply waited, vulnerable and afraid. Judge Carter studied her for a long moment before speaking. Ms. Harrington, the evidence presented in this case paints a clear picture of someone who believed her privilege placed her above the law. Your reckless actions endangered children. Your behavior toward Officer Diaz showed a disturbing lack of respect for authority and the rule of law. Jessica stared at the floor, unable to meet his gaze. In considering your sentence, I must weigh several factors, Judge Carter continued. The seriousness of your offenses, the need for deterrence, and the potential for rehabilitation. He paused, his expression thoughtful. The prosecution has recommended jail time, and given the charges, that would be entirely appropriate. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. Jail? Real jail. Her knees felt weak. However, Judge Carter said, his deep voice filling the silent courtroom, I believe there may be a more constructive path forward. Jessica looked up, surprised. You will serve 30 days in county jail, he declared, causing gasps throughout the courtroom. Additionally, you will pay a substantial fine of $25,000 to be donated to Westlake Elementary's traffic safety program. Jessica nodded numbly, relieved it wasn't worse, but still stunned by the reality of actual jail time. But that is not all, Judge Carter continued. Upon your release, you will complete 200 hours of community service working with children from underprivileged neighborhoods who have been victims of traffic accidents. You will see firsthand the consequences that reckless driving can have on young lives. Jessica's father stood up behind her. Your Honor, this is outrageous. My daughter has no experience with. Mr. Harrington, Judge Carter interrupted firmly, you are not a party to these proceedings. Please be seated or you will be removed from my courtroom. To Jessica's surprise, her father sat down, momentarily silenced by the judge's authority. Ms. Harrington, Judge Carter continued, his gaze returning to Jessica, the law applies equally to all citizens, regardless of wealth or status. True justice means facing consequences that foster genuine change, not just penalties your resources can easily dismiss. He leaned forward slightly. I believe you are more than the person we've seen in this courtroom. I believe you have the capacity for growth and transformation. Jessica blinked back unexpected tears, touched by this expression of faith that she had done nothing to earn. Then Judge Carter did something no one expected. Additionally, I am ordering monthly meetings between you and myself for the duration of your probation. We will discuss your community service experiences and your progress. This court is invested not just in punishing your actions, but in helping you become a better citizen. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. This was highly unusual. Your Honor, Jessica said, finding her voice at last. Why would you do that? Why give me a chance after how I've acted? Judge Carter's stern expression softened slightly. Because, Ms. Harrington, true justice isn't about punishment alone, but transformation. I believe you're capable of becoming more than your worst moments. The question is whether you believe it too. As Jessica was led away by the bailiff, she glanced back at Judge Carter. For the first time, she saw him not as an obstacle to overcome or an authority to manipulate, but as a human being trying to help her become a better person. The verdict had indeed been shocking, not for its harshness, but for its wisdom and compassion. As the courtroom doors closed behind her, Jessica realized that this ending was actually a beginning. The path would be difficult, but for the first time in her privileged life, it would be real.